welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and in this episode, rock star listener Helen Frank, who joined me on the fictional Secretaries of Agatha Christie, is back. The listener so nice, I invited her twice. Helen and I will be talking about the real secretaries of Agatha Christie, those secretaries who figured into Christie's life, and in some cases inspired her fictional characters. But before I bring Helen back on, I wanted to do a mini housekeeping segment, a listener mailbaglet, if you will, specifically concerning my and Helen's episode on the fictional secretaries. That seemed appropriate, and I'll be honest with you, listeners, I have so many listener messages to get through that it's helpful to break off a chunk right now. I'll probably end up doing another mailbag episode at some point in the fall or the winter, but I couldn't wait with these responses to the fictional secretaries episode. So here goes. This is actually going to be a spoiler-heavy housekeeping segment, as it so often is. The following Christie titles will be spoiled as I go through these messages to varying degrees. Cat Among the Pigeons, Death Comes at the End, Dead Man's Mirror, The Dream, The Hollow, The Incredible Theft, The Man in the Brown Suit, The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side, A Murder is Announced, Passenger to Frankfurt, A Pocket Full of Rye, The Submarine Plans, and The Underdog. You have been warned, listeners, and I will start off by spoiling a non-Christie title, which is The Leavenworth Case by Anna Catherine Green. So if you don't want that spoiled, stop listening or fast forward a minute or two. But I recently covered The Leavenworth Case on Patreon, and this is a late 19th century American mystery that Christie references in her autobiography as a foundational one for her, one that influenced her early on. And for this reason, I should have mentioned it because guess who is the murderer in the Leavenworth case? That's right, it's the secretary, the crazed male secretary. So there you go. Perhaps that is another reason why Christie turned to secretaries as much as she did. Okay, on to Christie texts. While I think Helen and I did ourselves proud when it came to the fictional secretaries of Agatha Christie, there were a few omissions in our episode, and I'm going to start with the one I heard about the most, which I think is the only one that's close to major. I'll read out this message that I got from friend of the podcast, David Morris, who runs Collecting Christie. By the way, David has started posting on Instagram at Collect Christie, and I encourage anyone who uses Instagram to follow him because his posts are always of interest and very pretty to look at. He has so many goodies, that David Morris. His message is going to stand in for several other messages that I got along the same lines, including one from a listener who was in the Agatha Christie fan club on Facebook, along with Helen Frank, and they had a little bit of an interaction over this as well. All right, here's what David had to say. I thoroughly enjoyed your podcast about secretaries in Christie's novels. It was most entertaining and provided great insights on a fresh topic. I would like to add what I believe is a very large omission from Christie's use of secretaries, one that is instrumental to the whole structure of the novel, well, short story collection, and that is Miss Robinson, aka Tuppence Beresford of Blunt's International Detective Agency. There are so many great lines in here where Christie rolls out all the tropes of a 1920s secretary and a woman here for the 20s. For example, Tuppence was stationed in an adjoining room with a typewriter, the necessary tables, and chairs of an inferior type to those in the room of the great chief, and a gas ring for making tea. That is from chapter 2. Then later in that chapter, Christie describes Tuppence in her role of secretary as very neat and demure, with smooth black head and dainty collars and cuffs. Very demure, very mindful. I added that last bit. I don't want to put memes in David Morris's mouth. David is absolutely right. How could we have forgotten about Miss Robinson? Tuppence gets up to lots of secretarial hijinks in Partners in Crime, and Christie definitely has fun in that collection, playing around with the role of an office secretary. Another one of you who wrote in about Miss Robinson mentioned the way that Tommy always calls her his confidential secretary, much to Tuppence's chagrin. I think the whole Miss Robinson charade just allows Christie to poke fun at the seemingly subservient role a secretary plays, and you can tell she delights in having Tuppence upend that subservience time and time again, which is something we see Tuppence do as to her role as a wife, generally, in so many of the Tommy and Tuppence stories. I think Miss Robinson is also notable as an early female secretary, since, as we noted on the episode, many of those other secretaries from the 1920s were men. As a reminder, the Partners in Crime collection was first published as a collection in 1929, but most of the stories in it were first serialized in the mid-1920s. All right, next I've got the only other omission that I think could potentially be termed glaring. I know this listener would certainly categorize it that way. Here goes. Hi, Kemper. As usual with your thematic all AC inclusive episodes, I really enjoyed your episode on the Secretaries of the Canon. I have to point, however, to one glaring omission. It concerns none other than podcast favorite, as well as mine favorite, novel, The Man in the Brown Suit. You correctly included Guy Padgett in your top 10 and mentioned Harry Rayburn and Miss Pettigrew in the comprehensive list at the end, but failed to mention that Anne Bedingfeld herself also becomes, briefly, a secretary to Sir Eustace Pedlar. This makes her another secretary detective in the canon, together with Victoria Jones and, somewhat, Hastings. It also leads to this wonderful passage from one of Sir Eustace's chapters, which is unforgivable not to have quoted in the episode itself. Okay, and here's the passage. As a reminder, this is Sir Eustace Pedlar jotting down his memoranda in his peculiarly jocular fashion. I'm inclined to abandon my reminiscences. Instead, I shall write a short article entitled, Secretaries I Have Had. As regards secretaries, I seem to have fallen under a blight. At one minute I have no secretaries, at another I have too many. And then we skip over a bunch of stuff. Yes, secretaries I have had. Number 1, a murderer fleeing from justice. Number 2, a secret drinker who carries on disreputable intrigues in Italy. Number 3, a beautiful girl who possesses the useful faculty of being in 2 places at once. Number 4, Miss Pettigrew, who, I have no doubt, is really a particularly dangerous crook in disguise. Probably one of Paget's Italian friends that he has palmed off on me. I shouldn't wonder if the world found someday that it had been grossly deceived by Paget. On the whole, I think Rayburn was the best of the bunch. He never worried me or got in my way. Guy Padgett has had the impertinence to have the stationery trunk put in here. None of us can move without falling over it. Oh, Sir Eustace, you are so charming and so evil. Every time I read a passage from Sir Eustace's diary, I think of Count Fosco in The Woman in White, to name another 19th century antecedent of Christie's. She is definitely drawing on the same tradition, and I love Count Fosco as much as I love Sir Eustace Pedlar. Okay, back to this listener's message. On a more minor note, I would like to mention a few memorable secretaries from short stories that were not included in the episode. Owen Trefusis from The Underdog and Hugo Cornworthy from The Dream, 2 secretary murderers, and Charles Templeton, one of the titular 4 suspects from the eponymous Marple story. Thank you for reminding us about that Sir Eustace Pedlar section, listener, and those secretaries from short stories. Another listener also brought up to me Sir Eustace Pedlar and his diatribe on secretaries, and this same listener also mentioned the short story The Underdog, so you 2 listeners are very much on the same wavelength, but these are all excellent points. All right, next up I've got a message from friend of the podcast, Brad Friedman, mystery blogger, Christie theater director, and just generally agathologist extraordinaire. I'm always interested to hear what Brad has to say. Here goes. Hey, Kemper. I enjoyed the secretary episode and, of course, agree and disagree with various choices you and your guest made. I loved your long discussion about Miss Blacklock, especially your description of one of my favorite scenes in the canon, the interview with Belle Gedler. The moments in Christie where she completely deludes her readers by being totally honest with us are some of my favorites, and the insistence by Belle, a minor character in whom we readers completely place our trust, that nobody is more honest and trustworthy than Letitia Blacklock is one of those moments. I'm also oddly pleased that you mentioned the ladies at the Cavendish Secretarial and Typing Bureau. Yes, that book stinks, but Sheila, Edna, and Miss Martindale are great characters. I would have included Hector McQueen over the guy in Chimneys, or even Horry and Kameni. I might have also considered Gwen Devon, a very prominent character in a problematic novel. And then Brad went on to write that he has much more fondness for a certain secretary killer than you do. In fact, in an article I wrote almost at the very beginning of my blog about professional people in Christie, I cited the importance of the secretary role and said this: I know the title of favorite secretary should go to Miss Lemon, Poirot's perfect assistant, but the honors go to the shapely Anne Shapland in Cat Among the Pigeons. Her observations of the peculiar goings-on at Meadowbank School add to the enjoyment of this mystery and ultimately play a major part in the unmasking of a cold-blooded killer. I love how Christie invites us to identify with Anne, to observe events through her, and to even cross her off our suspect list when she has dinner with Dennis while Miss Vansittart is being murdered. More cool Christie shenanigans. Regarding Horry and Kameni, I have never given much thought to this pair corresponding to Max and Archie, but that idea becomes intriguing when you realize that Agatha gave serious consideration to having Horry be the killer. Good old Max running amok in the Middle East. It would have been a better ending, I think, since we trust Horry. You even think of him as an unofficial sleuth here. Most important, we know from the autobiography that Stephen Glanville pushed Agatha to change the ending, although we aren't certain what this refers to. But say he didn't want her to make Max/Horry the killer. Why was that? Was it because he and Max were such good friends? Or was it because, as Laura Thompson suggests, Agatha and Stephen were having a sort of intellectual affair and he had other thoughts in mind? Or what if Stephen saw himself as Kameni and wondered if it was possible to try a polyamorous relationship with his favorite writer and his best friend? Idle gossip? Or truth? You be the judge, but I think it's just as reasonable as the absurd suggestion made by someone, I forget who, that the Reverend and Mrs. Dane Calthrop are Bunch Harmon's parents. Can you believe that? Oh, Brad, the Dane Calthrops are Bunch's parents. Just accept it. It's officially canon. And never change. Also, never stop sending me these messages. Okay. I'm going from one Christie theater director to another because this message is from Christopher Deal, whose triumphant Poirot double bill I watched recently, taking you all along with me to a day at the theater. Now is actually a good time to mention that Chris is staging Towards Zero, and yes, he is doing the version written by Agatha Christie, but of course, I wouldn't expect anything less of him. The show is going to be performed in the last few days of August and the first half of September. They've got a number of performances scheduled, actually. The company is the Riverside Community Players, and I will throw a link in the show notes. Go see it if you are in the area here in Southern California. Anyway, here is Chris's note to me about secretaries. Hi, Kemper. Just a quick note about your episode on the secretaries depicted in Agatha Christie's books. First off, I really enjoyed it. But when you got to Passenger to Frankfurt, I thought to myself, what about James Cleek? My memory of him was as a secretary, so I went back to the book. Granted, I didn't reread the whole thing, but based on a quick perusal, it doesn't look like he is ever specifically referred to as a secretary. But he sure does act like one. He's often depicted taking dictation, getting chairs for people, and of course we know he administers Altamont shots. Curious what you and your guest think of the strange case of Sir James Cleek and if he deserves a place with other villainous secretaries. Well, Chris, I think, sure. I can't really apologize for not thinking of Passenger to Frankfurt, but you make a good case. I think Sir James Cleek can absolutely be considered a secretary murderer. We really have quite a few of them in the Christie canon, more than I realized before doing this episode with Helen and continuing to think lots about it afterward. All right, I got this extremely academic and fascinating note from a learned listener whose contributions I always appreciate. Dear Kemper and Helen, I so enjoyed the episode and wanted to mention that the role of the secretary really became important in British public and political life in Henry VII's and his son, Henry VIII's, reigns in the 16th century, when the monarchy was being streamlined and organized in a more efficient, yes, that word, way. In fact, there was a type of handwriting actually called secretary hand, which I learned about when I was doing my MA in Shakespeare Studies, and we had to research and translate paleography. The current roles of civil servant and secretary to the Foreign Office grew out of those early modern roles. Well, thank you so much for that historical context, listener. I actually engaged in a little back and forth with this listener after she wrote this, which then led to this postscript. P.S. I was also thinking about Lottie when she becomes Letty at Little Paddocks. In the episode, you and Helen were saying that the two sisters were quite different, as Belle points out on her sickbed. But I actually feel that as well as taking on Blackie's identity, Lottie also takes on the former's traditionally masculine demeanor and approach to life. She's quite brusque, no nonsense, efficient, runs the house very well, etc., etc. And yet she was always the feminine sister, as Belle also points out. Maybe by Blackie dying, her sister could release or lean into that side of herself, which she couldn't while Letty was still alive. Just a thought. I wrote back to this listener and I said that I think the brilliant thing that Christie does with Letty and Lottie is that we never really know quite what either of them is like. Letty, because we never actually meet her, and Lottie, because we never actually see her being herself, whatever herself actually was. I love how Christie pulls off these sorts of filtered portrayals of characters who we never see clearly. We only see them obfuscated by the interpretations of others, and in Lottie's case, by her own subterfuge. It's similar to what Christie does with Mary Gerard in Sad Cypress, and of course with Caroline Crail, and to a certain extent Amyas Crail as well in Five Little Pigs. It's not an easy thing to pull off, but Christie does it so well. Just wanted to point that out. Moving right along here, another review wrote to point out that Bill Eversley in The Secret of Chimneys was a garbage secretary to an MP, very much in the mold of early Hastings. That is an excellent point. This same listener also brought up the fact that sometimes the more old-fashioned private secretary role of the 1920s and even earlier in the 20th century would involve a well-educated, well-positioned secretary who would sort of shepherd his or her self-made, often American, nouveau riche boss and show him, it's usually him, the ropes in terms of etiquette and taste generally, which just adds an extra layer to the class tensions involved in the secretarial role. I think that's a great point. And this same listener also mentioned the novella Dead Man's Mirror, in which we have yet another secretary murderer. And this is a really good one. Miss Lingard is a woman of lower social class who mixes with the upper classes during the social tumult of the war. That would be the Great War, the First World War. And she has to give up her baby. And she eventually sacrifices herself, murdering a man and hanging for the crime, or at least being arrested and prosecuted for the crime, all to preserve her daughter's privileged, wealthy life. The story ends with the daughter none the wiser why this woman did what she did, since Miss Lingard doesn't want her daughter to know who her biological mother was. And that is just an extremely dramatic secretary's tale, and worth mentioning for sure. So thank you for pointing that out, listener. All right, next I have an impassioned defense for one of the characters who Helen and I spoke about at some length, and I love an impassioned defense, so here goes. This listener actually ended up writing to both me and to Mark Aldridge and Gray Robert Brown of the Swinging Christies, since they too had discussed this character. All right, here goes. Hi, Kemper and Dr. Mark and Gray. I enjoyed your episode on Secretaries and Christie, but I have to quibble about the idea that Ella was in love with Jason. So this is involving the mirror cracked from side to side. I feel like this topic came up on the Swinging Christies recently, so I copied them. If I'm wrong, then my apologies. I will try and fail to keep this brief. I reread the book this week to remind myself of specifics. I think we should stop settling the question by saying she must have been, because all the characters thought she was in love with her boss. They assumed secretaries usually are, and that it must be true for her too. There really is nothing in the text to support it. After interviewing her, Craddock makes the assumption while noting that he has zero evidence for that conclusion. During the interview, I think she calls her boss, Jason Rudd, a genius, but it wasn't exactly gushing. The closest we get is the scene between her and Jason right before she dies. There's a line about Jason staring at the floor and that he would have been surprised at the look on her face. I always interpreted that it wasn't jealousy or longing, but her being annoyed or angry with Marina and how she was affecting everyone else. His surprise would be that not everyone was as worried about Marina as he was. Ella then voices concern about what would happen to the picture if he took Marina away. Jason replies that he can only think of Marina. Just before she dies, there's a passage about fury rising up in her as she thought of Marina's name. I did not read it as fury that Jason was with Marina instead of her, but rather because of how Marina's actions were affecting everyone. Anyway, that's my defense of Ella for what it's worth. And then this listener continued, you captured a lot of secretaries in the episode. I've always been fond of the ladies in Pocketful of Rye. We spend a decent amount of time with the head of the secretaries, Miss Grosvenor, and the secretary who never gets the kettle boiling. I always wondered how that would negatively affect the tea. Another one I am fond of, I think she came up in the episode, is Dr. Christo's secretary in The Hollow, who barely put up with him. In her case, I think it was quite clear to everyone that she was not in love with him. I'm a fan of anyone who was annoyed by Dr. Christo, one of the least sympathetic victims in Christie's work. Anyway, thanks to all of you for great podcasts. I really enjoy listening to them. And then this listener actually sent a follow-up email. Back to my case for Ella for a second. I wrote my first email before I finished the book. There is a scene between Marina and Jason after Ella and Giuseppe dies where they are trying to figure out what happened. Marina tells Jason that Ella was in love with him, but he never noticed. Marina is not very truthful in this scene, so I don't believe her. It's also possible she fell into the same trap of assuming Ella was in love with her boss, like everyone else. All right, I wrote back to this listener and told her that while I still believe the quote-unquote dominant interpretation of what Ella does and says in this book is that she is indeed in love with her boss, Jason Rudd, to me it reads like she truly is in love with him, even though everyone does assume the same. That being said, I'm a big fan of alternate and, in particular, stubbornly alternate readings because I think they are often much more interesting. So thank you for your passion, listener, and for backing it up with textual evidence. You are definitely fighting the good fight where Ella Zielinski is concerned. Also, I mentioned in my episode all about the audiobooks of Agatha Christie that no one wrote in to identify the opening scene of A Pocketful of Rye as one that features some fabulous secretaries, but as you just heard, this listener absolutely did exactly that. So I extend my apologies to this listener for forgetting it at the time I was recording that episode. It's comforting to know that Miss Summers, Miss Griffith, Miss Grosvenor, and Miss Bell of Consolidated Investments Trust have not been forgotten. I mean, the way that novel opens up, it seems like the poisoning of Mr. Fortescue has happened in his very office, and the secretaries themselves are going to be the main suspects, but then we realize he had to have been poisoned much earlier, and the secretaries recede into the background. But the scene definitely deserves to be remembered. Finally, one of you wrote in to mention the secretarial element of the short story, The Submarine Plans. Now, this story often gets overlooked because it was later expanded into the novella, The Incredible Theft. But part of the reason why the deception in the short story plays out the way it does is that the Ministry of Defense and a future prime minister, this very powerful man, does not want his beloved, loyal secretary to fall under any suspicion when certain submarine plans go missing. Because as it turns out, it is the minister himself who is behind the missing plans. We do get a passing reference to the same notion in the longer version, in The Incredible Theft, but I think there's a bit more of it made in the submarine plans. That's my impression, anyway, as I somewhat hastily revisit both of these texts, and I think it's a nice touch. So hooray for the submarine plans. Sometimes in Christie, secretaries really are given their proper due. Well, thank you to all the listeners who wrote into me about the fictional secretaries of Agatha Christie. I really enjoyed that. I know Helen Frank enjoyed it as well. And it is now time to discuss some more secretaries. Let's get into it. Helen and I are going to be discussing the real life secretaries of Agatha Christie. Helen was not scared away by her first appearance on All About Agatha when we discussed the fictional secretaries of Agatha Christie. If you have not yet listened to that episode, you certainly don't have to appreciate this episode, but I think actually your enjoyment of it will be enhanced. So I encourage you to check out that episode where we went deep on the many 50-something secretaries within Agatha Christie's fiction. And as we noted on that episode, since Agatha Christie wrote from life as much as she did, it should come as no surprise that she knew a lot of secretaries and had a lot of experience of secretaries in her own life. And she drew on those secretaries to a certain extent when she created her fictional one. So this, I think, is an episode where we are going to get to talk about the biography of Agatha Christie. We get to talk about her life, but it will definitely, I think, help give us a greater understanding of her fiction, in addition to an understanding of Agatha Christie, the person. And both of those things fascinate me. And hopefully they interest you as well. I know that they interest Helen, since she did all of the work to go into this episode, just as she did her previous one. And I'm just going to give you a little primer on who she is, in case this is the first time that you are experiencing my listener co-host here. It isn't every day that a listener of All About Agatha becomes a co-host, but here we are. Helen Frank is a third-generation Agatha Christie fan. Her grandmother and her mother are voracious readers, and like many people out there listening to this podcast, Helen started reading her grandmother and her mother's copies of mystery novels as a child, including their Agatha Christie's. And by her teens, she had a full set of numbered chronological Agatha Christie paperbacks that eventually wore out from overuse. She now lives in the north of England with her husband and 2 cats. And her 2 cats are named Agatha and Christie, which just delights me to no end. Helen completed a read-through of a new set of books in 2015, which was excellent timing since the All About Agatha podcast started in 2016. And she has been a longtime listener to the regular podcast, as well as a longtime patron on Patreon. And she was actually the direct inspiration to a holiday episode I did on Patreon all about Inside Number 9, a cult sort of British comedy / drama / horror sketch show. It's so weird. It's hard to talk about, but I'm very thankful to her for introducing me to it, and just for being such a fan of Christie in general, and for appearing now on the podcast. She has worked in an office for nearly 30 years, so she has sort of developed over time a particular interest in this subset of the help, which is secretaries. And we talked fairly broadly about who the secretaries are and what the role of secretary means in the mysteries of Agatha Christie on our first episode. So I think on this episode now, in which we are going to talk about real life secretaries, we're just going to get into it and run down our top 10 list. And I would love, Helen, if you could get us started.
Okay, so at number 10, we have the secretary at the Imperial Continental Gas Association. And if everybody's wondering who on earth that could be, that would be also in Agatha Christie's life, it's Nancy Neal. So Nancy Neal, as I'm sure everybody remembers, is Agatha's first husband's second wife, and is very well known for her involvement in the breakdown of Agatha's first marriage. If you want further details, listen to the All About Agatha episode, all about the real-life disappearance of Agatha Christie.
Thank you for that plug, Helen.
It's my second episode.
You're already getting the hang of it.
Yeah. Yes. So Nancy was a secretary who trained at the Triangle Secretarial College, and then through a friend from college, and I think also somebody who she worked with at the Continental Gas Association, she met Archie. So her friend was called Madge Fox, and her husband was called Frank James, and Frank worked with Archie. So that's how they met. And Nancy and Archie were actually at Madge and Frank's cottage the night that Agatha disappeared.
That's so interesting. And, where the car disappeared was not that far away, right? From where they were. And, even though what we're not going to do on this episode is speculate about the relationship between Nancy Neal and Archie Christie prior to their marriage, but I think it cannot be denied what a significant role Nancy Neal played in the life of Agatha Christie, whatever that exactly means, and we'll never know. And I think we can leave it at that, but I just couldn't resist the temptation to put Nancy Neal in dead last place here on this list. And one thing I'll note, actually, is that you do sometimes see Nancy Neal referred to especially in sort of summations of the breakdown of Christie's marriage, of like, oh, here's what happened, and on various websites. She gets referred to as Archie's secretary. But as far as I can tell, that is not the case whatsoever. That's just a cliched interpretation of the situation, because we're used to the secretary being in love with her employer and carrying on an affair. She was a secretary, and Archie took an interest in her. She also was known to Ernest Belcher, who was the man who brought Archie and Agatha on to that 1922 British Empire exhibition tour. So she was sort of within the mix, right, of their acquaintance. They in fact knew each other, before everything happened as to the breakdown of Agatha Christie's marriage. So this is someone who was in her circle, and then things got complicated.
Yeah, and I believe in the autobiography, of which I am actually a very big fan as well. So I'm very happy. We're doing
not a surprise, Helen. Not a surprise.
Yeah, but in the autobiography, Agatha never says the name Nancy Neal, but she calls her Belcher secretary, which I thought was interesting because I don't think she was that either.
Yeah, I don't think she was quite his secretary, but I think she was providing secretarial services adjacent to him, it seems. But yes, it's all a little confusing, but definitely a secretary of significance here. And on that theme, we are going to move right along now to our 9th real life secretary on this list, who is Barbara Parker, secretary/librarian of the British School of Archaeology in Iraq, which we can just now abbreviate as BSI because that's a mouthful. And this was a very important organization within the life of Agatha Christie, and especially her second husband, Max Mallowan. And here in Barbara Parker, we have Agatha Christie's second husband's second wife. So I love this. Nancy Neal, 10th secretary on this list, is Agatha Christie's first husband's second wife. Barbara Parker is her second husband's second wife. So Agatha Christie followed by secretaries for
men who loved secretaries.
Yes, she loved men who loved secretaries. We can certainly say that. I just have to note, I don't actually think, in the same way, I don't really believe that Nancy Neal deserves a quote unquote bad place on this list. I certainly don't think that Barbara Parker deserves it. It was just too delicious not to put her and Nancy Neal back to back, so to speak. It's always annoyed me that Max Mallowan barely lived much longer than Agatha Christie. I think it was like a year and change, or maybe about 2 years. And yet he managed to marry another woman in that short time. But such is life. And I think that, like all relationships, the relationship between Agatha Christie and her second husband was just as complicated as a relationship between her and her first husband. And Barbara Parker is someone who was within their circle and a part of their lives for decades. I mean, a really, really significant figure within the archaeological milieu. The milieu in which Christie existed for so long, and she got some of her stories out of it, and a lot of joy, actually. And she references Barbara in her notes sometimes. I know there's at least one instance in the Secret Notebooks, as published by John Curran, where she references a character as a Barbara type. And this is just someone who was a good friend and, a work acquaintance, and who loomed large in their lives, and who became increasingly important to them as they grew older. I found this tidbit in Janet Morgan's biography, which I thought was really interesting. When Christie fell ill at the very end of her life, Barbara Parker would actually come over to Winterbrook House on the weekends to give Max some relief from all the caretaking that he was doing, and she would help take care of the elderly Agatha Christie, or Lady Mallowan. That shows, I think, how intimate she was with them and what good friends they were. Janet Morgan definitely characterizes Max's marriage to Barbara as happening within the context of his bereft state, having lost his longtime wife. It's just obvious that there's a lot going on there. And I think certainly to characterize Barbara Parker as the quote unquote other woman in the same way that people might want to do with Nancy Neal, it would be a mischaracterization. I just want to be very clear about that.
Yeah. One of the interesting things is I think Barbara Parker's mentioned in the Secret Notebooks, but I don't think she's ever mentioned in the autobiography. And
no, I don't think
Max
she is.
Actually published his memoirs. Well, Max's memoirs actually end with the death of Agatha. That's the last thing that happens in the book, and then I think he published them the year after. So it was probably, like you said, he published them in the year of her dying. But Barbara Parker only gets mentioned once. But as you say, they worked together for a long time. So whether it was deliberate that she wasn't mentioned very much, I think maybe she's mentioned twice. Max has a paragraph on her. And then I think also there's some of the poems that Agatha wrote, because Agatha used to write poems about people that were on the Nimrod dig. And I think it includes one of the ones about Barbara.
And he did, just to be clear, he died, Max Mallowan passed away in August of 1978. So he lived a little over 2 years after Agatha, actually.
Yeah.
And interestingly, Barbara Parker actually passed away in Wallingford in 1993, and she was 85 years old, which is the exact same age that Agatha Christie was when she passed away, and when her daughter Rosalind passed away as well, all at the age of 85. A good long life. Yeah, she's an interesting figure. I think you had actually highlighted some text actually from Max Mallowan's memoirs, right, Helen? And I wonder if you could read that out, because he does describe Barbara, and I think it gives a good visual sense of her.
Okay, here we go. For so large a dig, we managed on the ideal modicum, last but not least, a secretary. His last office was filled for most of the years by Barbara Parker, who was expected to do everything, especially to take the blame when things went wrong. The catchword was sacked again, and what we would have done without this paragon, I do not know. Barbara, a woman of dauntless courage, usually dressed in red, white, or blue Kurdish trousers, florally adorned, sound very nice, took all crises in her stride and volunteered to go out before the beginning of every season, repair the roof, and make the house habitable. Inclined to be forgetful, she was often driven to borrow money from the men in order to pay them. They took this in good part and were grateful to her as their medical officer, ever ready to administer to ailments that ranged from bloody flux to stoppage. Barbara was no less of an asset to the staff, for at table she kept us continually amused with entertaining conversations and was ever ready to take the part of court jester or Shakespearean clown.
That's so interesting.
That Max was obsessed with bowels as well.
Well, and not the stereotypical depiction of a secretary, certainly, that I think we get more often than not in Christie, but it sounds like she was full of life. She was a little scattered, perhaps not a model of efficiency, but a lot of fun to be around, which was so important on those digs. I think the personalities were key there. People had to mesh well. And if you cut a few corners as to what you were doing, fine. As long as you knew how to get along and how to be good company. She sounds great. She sounds like a lot of fun.
Yes, she seems to have been well liked by everybody. And she was also, her job title was secretary librarian, but she was actually an archaeologist herself. She was an epigraphist. So
yes, and appointed as an officer of the Order of the British Empire. She got her OBE for her services as secretary and librarian of the BSI. So, which, as far as I know, I believe this makes her the only secretary on this list who was actually awarded an honor for her secretarial services. I don't see anyone giving Nancy Neal any awards.
Unlikely.
Just saying, Nancy. So yeah, 3 cheers for Barbara Parker. All right, let's move on to our 8th secretary, Elsa Jolly, who was a typist for Agatha Christie. Could you tell us about Elsa?
Yes, so Elsa was an audio typist for Agatha towards the end of her life. I think this is when she was dictating most of her novels. So Mrs. Jolly would take recordings and then type them up and send them for editing or not editing. Maybe not enough editing, I think. Some of those later ones. There are various books that have come up for auction that have been personally inscribed for Elsa Jolly. But then, according to Laura Thompson, I think it was after Mrs. Jolly died, so possibly her family incurred the wrath of Rosalind because they sold the audio recordings for Poston of Fate in 1989. So as you can imagine, Rosalind was not happy about that.
So the recordings of her dictation, right, when she was...
The dictation of Poston of Fate, which I can...
That was probably a rough recording. Yeah. That's the reason why Elsa Jolly is getting 8th place here on this list. Even if it was her family, then, she's taken the fall for her descendants. That was a little naughty of her to allow those recordings out of the inner circle. It sounds like she did a good job for Christie when she was working for her.
Yes, and she also, if we're relating these people back to their fictional counterparts, it looks as if, Elsa Jolly certainly did audio transcription work for other authors, so perhaps she was somebody who worked for the equivalent of Miss Martingale. She was also a typist for John Wyndham, the science writer, who I think wrote The Day of the Triffids. That's a John Wyndham book.
That's quite a range there, Agatha Christie to John Wyndham. That's...
Yeah.
It's pretty cool. I think Miss Martindale and the Clocks would have been lucky to have her, but I could see an Elsa Jolly type appearing in the Clocks. All right, let's move on to another secretary who Christie would have known professionally. This is number 7, Nora Blackborough, who was the secretary to Edmund Cork. Edmund Cork, of course, was Christie's longtime agent at the Hughes Massey agency. And we mainly know of Nora because she was the dedicatee of Third Girl, actually. And she seems to have been the point of contact at the agency at Hughes Massey for all Christie matters from the 1950s to the 1970s. So when people would inquire as to permissions or, reproducing the work or things like that, that is a busy job, especially when you're dealing with someone as prolific and as in demand as Agatha Christie. I mean, that is a full-time job right there. I think you could have probably had 2 people doing all of that. So I have to imagine that Nora, had her work cut out for her. But you actually discovered a little bit of a dedication mystery when it comes to Nora Blackborough. Please tell us about that, Helen.
Yes, when I was looking in my copy of Third Girl, looking for secretaries, I happened to glance at the dedication in the front, and I noticed that in my copy it didn't say to Nora Blackborough, it said to Nora, and Nora was spelled with an H on the end, which it didn't appear to be for Nora Blackborough, to Nora Blackmore. Who is Laura Blackmore? Is it a typo? So, Kemper, I believe you checked your copy as well.
I have. So yeah, Helen asked me to check my copy, and because I did a whole episode all about the dedications of Agatha Christie, right? And when I did that episode, I was kind of compiling or amassing dedications from several online sources who had themselves compiled that information. So when I went through and I was looking at the Third Girl dedication, I had the original, what seems to be the first edition dedication to Nora Blackborough, Nora, and then Blackborough, as opposed to Nora with an H, Blackmore. But when I went and I looked at my copy of Third Girl, which is a very recent edition, it's, the most recent UK edition of these works, published in the last couple of years, it says, Nora Blackmore, Nora with an H, Blackmore. Was there a typo at some point and someone just accidentally said Blackmore rather than Blackborough and spelled her name differently? Is this actually a different person? Did she go by Blackmore? The change in the spelling of Nora is very suspicious also. This is on the order of Joyce Lampriere and Joan West. I don't know what's going on here.
Yeah. It's and so my copy is the one that I did my reread from in the early 2010s. So it's one of the reproduction first editions that there was in the UK. They did a 90-piece part work, and every month you got a new hardback book that had a reproduction first edition cover on it. So, mine's pretty recent as well. But yes, if people could look and see who their copy of Third Girl is dedicated to.
Exactly. First of all, take a look at the dedication of Third Girl. I'm sure, I know that there are an array of editions out there that listeners are using. So I'd be really interested to see who has Nora Blackmore versus Nora Blackborough. And then in particular, if anyone can shed light on why these 2 different names exist. It's very, very strange. Dedications don't just morph in this way. It really could be some sort of typographical error, I suppose, which then just continued in future editions, but it's very, very strange. So I have no idea what's going on there. I look forward to hearing from some listeners.
Yeah. So Kemper, I did get my own Mr. Goby, aka my mum, on the case here. She has a subscription to some genealogical websites, so she can look stuff up. Because my theory was, well, maybe did Nora get married? Maybe, and
of course,
because that was very close, they changed the name in the dedication. But looking at Nora Blackborough, she was born in 1906, I think. So by the time of Third Girl, which was 1966, she would be 60. It's probably unlikely that she would be getting married.
Right. She would have been either already married or unmarried and probably remained unmarried, right? Yeah.
So
not necessarily. I mean, hey, late marriages happened then too. But yeah, I agree. Well, and that's why the changing of the Nora, of the spelling of the first name too. There's something. This isn't just a maiden name, married name situation. Plus, the last name is half the same. Like Blackborough versus Blackmore.
Blackmore.
Yeah, very, very weird. So please write in about that. I love having a mystery to solve.
Yeah. One last thing on my mum's little piece of detective work today. In 1939, there was it wasn't a census, but it was all people in the UK were registered. Obviously, so they knew that the war was coming and they wanted to know who was in the country and what they did. So there are extensive records of people in 1939, and I used them before when you were doing the dedications to find out where Agatha was in 1939. But when we looked up Nora Blackborough in there, her job title was actually listed as executive literary agent rather than secretary. So she got a title bump.
Look at that. And she was Nora Blackborough then as well.
She was Nora Blackborough, yes.
And she would have been about 30. You said she was born in 1906. So she would have been about 33.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Really, really interesting. Mm-hmm. Tell us your secrets, Nora Blackborough, or maybe a descendant, wherever you are. All right. That's our 7th secretary on the list. Don't touch that dial. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of our episode. We just wanted to take a moment to ask you, our dear listeners, for a favor.
If you haven't already done so, we would very much appreciate it if you take a moment to, give us a rating or a review wherever you're listening to this podcast.
It really helps the podcast out because ratings and reviews make it much easier for other Christie fans such as yourselves to find our podcast.
And the more ratings and reviews we get, the more people we can reach.
It should take you a matter of seconds, and lucky you, we're going to provide you with those seconds right now, so go to it.
Thank you so much. And now, back to our regularly scheduled programming.
Let's move on now to our 6th, which is Daphne Honeybone. This is a secretary/typist to both Agatha and Max, and she was the dedicatee for Nemesis. She seems to have been involved in Agatha's care at the end of her life, and she actually continued to work for Max after Agatha passed away. I believe you found some auction lots, right, for a couple of different books that had personal inscriptions to Daphne on them?
Yes, yeah. A Halloween Party, Elephants Can Remember, Poirot's Early Cases. So
and that makes sense. Those are all very late career Christie. So late 60s, early 70s is, and that's of course when Nemesis also came out. So this is someone who seems to have been very important to Christie, especially later on in life. And for that, we salute her. Mm-hmm. All right, moving right along to our top half of the list now. Helen, tell us about secretary number 5.
Okay, so at number 5, we have Elizabeth. Do you think it's Christman or Christman?
I would probably say Christman. No, I think I would say Christman, actually.
Christman. Okay, so at number 5,
as we've established, don't go to me.
I know this is an American, so I'm.
It doesn't matter.
Okay, at number 5, we have Elizabeth, possibly Christman, who was secretary to Dorothy Alding at Harold Ober Associates, who were Christie's American agents. So this one first might feel like we're reaching here a bit to find 10 secretaries, but Elizabeth is quite an interesting person, I think, in her own right. So I'll do a little biography of her.
Please.
She had ambitions herself to be an author, but World War II got in the way, so she did a war service in the Navy. And then after the war, she decided to move to New York and get a job in a literary agency, which she did. She started as a secretary. I think she probably worked her way up. So she began work with Harold Ober, and she stayed there for more than 20 years, learning the business as she went. And in 1966, this is from her memoirs that are online, moreover, it had some very exciting moments. For instance, hiring a limousine and escorting Agatha Christie to Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn to visit the grave of her American grandfather. So I think, Kemper, you know a bit more about that, don't you?
Yeah, well, and those are the Millers. Her father, famously or infamously, perhaps, an American, and she really did want to, look up those American ancestors. And this trip in 1966 was something that we actually talked about, Catherine and I, when we were covering Halloween Party, because this is the trip where she got a sense of Halloween in the United States, which at that time was a little different from what was happening in the UK. And It's why I maintain that Halloween Party is her most American novel, because a lot of the Halloween stuff that's going on in there is actually a little bit more culturally American at that time than what you usually get in Christie, since she's usually oh so very English. And she got up to a lot of things on this trip. And I believe that I mentioned this on the Halloween Party episode, but it's too funny not to tell the story again. Because on this trip, she tasked Dorothy Olding, who Elizabeth Kreisman was working for, with finding a large pair of underwear. And I'm going to quote from Edmund Cork now, her UK agent, in a letter that he wrote to Dorothy Olding, her US agent. This is what Edmund Cork had to say. She remembered your prowess, and I am awfully afraid, sweetie, you are for it. And what Edmund Cork means there is that apparently Dorothy Olding had gotten her hands on what Janet Morgan, the biographer Janet Morgan, describes as an enormous swimsuit for Agatha Christie. So finding this underwear was the next task that Christie set out for her U.S. agent. And we've all read enough Christie and probably have enough life experience to know who must have been ultimately responsible for finding that big pair of underwear. It was the help, i.e. Elizabeth Kreisman. I think poor Elizabeth was probably the one who had to, go to some department store or something and figure out where the big granny undies were. And I think for that reason alone, she has earned her spot here in number 5 in the top half of this list.
Yeah, but she didn't spend all her days looking for enormous underwear.
She didn't.
I know, probably a step down, but she started taking classes at NYU in the 1960s, and then in the late 1960s, so by this time she was in her 50s, she decided to have a career change. So she became a teacher, she got her PhD, and eventually she became a professor of American Studies at Notre Dame University. So a long way from being a secretary looking for big knickers.
I hope that granny underwear was just a distant memory at that point, at which she was behind the lectern, and that she could really just put that whole ordeal behind her. That is Elizabeth Kreisman. All right, let's move on to our 4th secretary here on this list. We actually mentioned this man, a rare man on the list, in our episode about the fictional secretaries of Agatha Christie. Take it away, Helen.
Okay, so at number 4, we have Mr. F.W. Bates. First name's unknown. And yes, he was secretary to Major Ernest Belcher, who was the leader of the 1922 British Empire Exhibition mission that Archie and Agatha went on around the world. And Mr. Bates was one of their secretaries. Major Belcher, I think, was a man who liked having people around him, and they did pick up some secretaries on their way around the world, including one who eventually married Major Belcher, actually, a lady from Australia. But on this list, we have got Mr. Bates because he eventually became the inspiration for the secretary Guy Paget in The Man in the Brown Suit, where, of course, Major Belcher was the inspiration for Sorostis Peddler in that book.
You pulled some of the text, because I'd love if you can compare the description of Mr. Bates in the autobiography to the description of Paget in The Man in the Brown Suit.
Yeah, okay, so this is from the autobiography. Mr. Bates, Belcher's secretary, was a serious and credulous young man. He was an excellent secretary, but had the appearance of a villain in a melodrama, with black hair, flashing eyes, and an altogether sinister aspect. Looks a complete thug, doesn't he? Said Belcher. You'd say he was going to cut your throat at any moment. Actually, he is the most respectable fellow you have ever known. So that's what Major Belcher thought about his secretary, and then Sir Ostis thought about his secretary in The Man in the Brown Suit. Guy Paget is my secretary, a zealous, painstaking, hard-working fellow, admirable in every respect. The only amusing thing about the fellow is his face. He has the face of a 14th century poisoner, the sort of man the Borgias got to do their odd jobs for them.
I love that.
So definitely the same person.
Definitely the same person. Much, and the description I think is appropriately a little bit more flowery and gets at precisely what his face looks like in the text of The Man in the Brown Suit. A 14th century poisoner, the Borgias. Like, I know exactly what she means, and I actually have confirmation of that because there is a photo, an iconic photo of Christie on this British Empire exhibition when she was surfing. when she was doing her upright surfing, one of the first Westerners to do that in Hawaii. There's this great photo of Belcher, Bates, Agatha, and Archie. And she's totally right. His face, he looks like one of these. He looks like he could be in a melodrama. What I thought of was those old 1920s silent movies where the man in the cape ties the heroine to the railroad tracks. He looks like that.
Absolutely, I've done that.
It's pretty remarkable. So that photo is in the autobiography. It's also Googleable. And you know what? Maybe I will, since the All About Agatha Instagram account is the only social media I get up to these days, that is a visual medium. And if I can figure it out how to do it so that the photo actually looks all right, I will post a photo to the Instagram account and you can see for yourselves. But it's very amusing how poor Mr. Bates really does look like a villain. And that is what has been immortalized now for a century and counting by way of the man in the brown suit, even though it sounds like he was a very good secretary. And again, our lone male secretary on this list is just as in the case of the fictional secretaries of Agatha Christie, especially I think as we move ahead in the 20th century, just the lion's share of secretaries were women and not men. So shout out there to Mr. F.W. Bates. All right, let's move on now to our bronze medalist in our third position here of the real life secretaries of Agatha Christie. Who do we have, Helen?
We have my personal favorite and possibly the person that I've bugged you about most over the last few years. In bronze medal position, we have Molly Myers, who was secretary to Mortimer Wheeler and the British Academy. So this was one of your, when you did the dedication episode, this was one of the mystery dedicatees.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes, I myself as the person who bombarded you with emails. I tried to think what that inbox looked like when you finally saw it.
You really, well, now it makes sense too. You're referencing your Mr. Goby. I mean, you really took this and ran with it because you solved that mystery.
Yes, yeah. I had a very empty weekend that weekend, and yes, I was Googling like a demon. So yes, well, I found Molly Myers. Yes, so yeah, Mortimer Wheeler was an archaeologist. I think not a particularly nice man from reading it. He was married a couple of times, I think, and wasn't particularly nice to either of his wives. But yes, he was president, I think, of the British Academy, and while he was there, he employed Molly Myers as actually a secretary for the Academy, I think, rather than his own secretary. She appeared to have, I think, she must have had sort of Miss Lemon levels of efficiency, certainly enough for Agatha to dedicate Elephants Can Remember to her. When this is somebody who wasn't Agatha's secretary, wasn't Max's secretary, wasn't a secretary for a business that was working for Agatha. This is somebody who was a secretary for a completely separate organisation, but she did enough for Agatha to, I think the dedication says, in return for many kindnesses.
And so her boss then, this man at the British Academy, what was his name again?
Mortimer Wheeler.
Mortimer Wheeler, right. So it is curious now that you say that, I mean, that she wasn't working directly for Christie, but the British Academy was doing work that would have been important to the Mallowans by way of all of their archaeological
I think so. I
activities.
Think Matt was probably a member, is the right word, of the British Academy. And also I think there is something on Wikipedia that Agatha and Max and Mortimer Wheeler went to visit a dig, I think, in the 1960s together.
Okay. So she, just being the sort of super efficient sort of presence that she was, probably just made their lives easier in probably countless little ways, or maybe big ways. The current president of the British Academy at the time that she was retiring then gave this lovely speech, right? And I wonder if you could just read it out, because it's really wonderful, the words that they say about her.
Okay. What the Academy owes her is unique. She knew fellows individually better than any living person. She understood them, their qualities, their tastes, their needs better than anyone else. The organisation of the work of the sections, the entertainment of academic visitors, receptions, the annual dinner, indeed the entire social life of the Academy were largely maintained and promoted by her. Fellows invariably sought advice from her in all kinds of formal and informal ways, and always obtained it. She carried on the work of the admirable Miss Pearson with a degree of skill, efficiency, charm, and a capacity for firm, all but unalterable, and virtually infallible decision, and brought to everything a wonderful style and elegance. For all this, the Academy will be forever grateful to her.
Yeah, that's really lovely. I mean, it was funny to me upon rereading this, though, because I remember that speech from when I'm sure you showed it to me. Um, it's funny that her predecessor, Miss Pearson, is mentioned, in this speech about her. It's a little bit like, oh yes, she continued on the work of the admirable Miss Pearson. It's a little bit like the comparing that Ariadne Oliver does.
Yeah.
In Elephants Can Remember, which is the book that she dedicated to Molly herself. So I think it's just funny. I guess that's just something that we do. And I think especially perhaps with like secretarial work, which is often in support, there's just an emphasis on continuity. I think that's the point there, where it's sort of like, to be able to just have a person, the person who's doing the job change, but have the support remain the same. Like there's a real value in that. And that's not something that everyone can do. So.
Exactly. And I do wonder from this, it seems that she was very involved in organising the social side of the academy. And I would imagine that Agatha would be involved in that, even if she wasn't involved in the academic side of the British Academy. And maybe that's why she was performing many kindnesses.
Yes. And I think, we have this depiction of Christie as this camera shy, retiring person who, didn't like to socialize at all. And that's certainly not true. I think the issue is she didn't like to do press about her books. But when it came to Max's career, I think she was more than happy because she had nothing to prove to anyone. She was more than happy to be his plus one to those things and, to be Lady Mallowan and I'm sure chat everyone up and have a lovely time. And that's probably where she was in her element. So it's interesting to imagine this person being involved in her life and having that level of intimacy. It's a little unexpected, but it makes sense when we stop to think about it.
Yeah. And I think when you did the dedications episode, you read out the quote from, I think it was from the eulogy for Molly Myers. And from that, it seemed, I don't have it, so I'll paraphrase it, but it seemed like her and Agatha enjoyed the same sort of things. I think it mentions in there that Molly Myers liked going to the theatre and she liked art and she liked reading, which all seem very Christie-ish pursuits.
Yes.
So I can imagine them bonding over that sort of thing as well.
Absolutely. Just like a shared love of life. It's sort of, Molly Myers is a great reminder of just the fact that, yes, Agatha Christie was this writer who spent her life, writing 66 books, but partly because she was such an efficient writer herself. I mean, she certainly had efficiency when it came to her own career. She did a lot more than that. And I think it was really important to her to live life and have fun and go out to the theater and talk with people and go to dinners and overeat sometimes and, go to museums and talk about books that she had read with other people and have interesting philosophical conversations. And she's just such an alive person, as she would describe, some of her characters. She was more alive than, you can imagine. But yes, it sounds like Molly Myers shared some of those qualities. I can just imagine the two of them having a nice time together. All right. Well, let's talk about, I don't know who can follow that, but we shall find out. Who do we have in our silver medal spot here at number 2?
Okay, so at number 2, we have another dedicatee. So this is Stella Kerwin, who was secretary to Agatha Christie in the 1950s. So she was actually a joint dedicatee of Cat Among the Pigeons, and she shared the dedication with her husband, Lawrence Kerwin, who was actually an archaeologist. So both of them were working, I guess, with and for the Mallowans.
Yeah, and they both, they had that in common. They both had archaeologist husbands.
Yes. Yes. So I think there are a couple of anecdotes in Janet Morgan's book about Stella. The first one being that she was kind of the inspiration, or she gave Agatha the inspiration for Ordeal by Innocence. She showed Agatha an article about an Antarctic explorer returning home, and anybody who's read Ordeal by Innocence knows that that's the start of Ordeal by Innocence. Actually, I did find out that as well as being an archaeologist, Lawrence Kerwin was actually a director of the Royal Geographical Society and helped organise Antarctic and Everest expeditions. So I don't know if it was showing Agatha an article about an Antarctic explorer or just talking about her husband's work.
Oh, she was probably just particularly keyed into anything involving Antarctic exploration. That's interesting.
Yes, she gave her the idea for Ordeal by Innocence and got a dedication in the next book. I think that's a very fair exchange. But then the thing that I'm sure Agatha was most pleased about with Stella was there was a program in the UK called This Is Your Life. Was it an American program as well? Or an American version?
Yes. No, it's definitely, I feel like that's just part of the cultural fabric at this point. This is your life. Yeah.
So anybody under the age of 40.
I was going to say for us older people anyway.
Yeah. So This Is Your Life was a program where usually celebrities, but I think sometimes real people, were basically surprised by the host, who would ambush them and take them off to a TV studio where their friends and family would come in and tell anecdotes about them, and the honoree would just generally be lauded. It's like an anti-roast, I guess, would be the way to describe it. And the important thing is that the honoree never knew that this was going to happen. It was always going to be a surprise. It's always a surprise to them. So, unsurprisingly, the TV producers thought that Agatha Christie would be an interesting person to surprise with the This Is Your Life episode. But fortunately, Stella persuaded them that it wouldn't be something that Agatha would be interested in doing. And so it never happened. And I'm sure when Agatha found out, she was eternally grateful, because it sounds like her idea of hell, I think.
Oh my God. I cannot imagine anything worse that one could do to Agatha Christie than subject her to a surprise This Is Your Life program. I mean, thank the Lord for Stella Kerwin. I mean, The Ordeal by Innocence too. I mean, to be the catalyst for that novel, even though it's not one of my favorites, is almost enough, I think, to put her in this position. But thank goodness for Stella Kerwin for knowing Agatha Christie as well as she did.
Yes, definitely deserves their number 2 spot on the list.
Yes. All right. Well, I think there's a bit of a leap to make to get to number 1. And, our number 1 fictional secretary was a bit obvious in Miss Felicity Lemon. And I think we have a similar situation here. Helen, who is our top real life secretary?
Our top real life secretary is Charlotte, or Carlo Fisher, who was secretary to Agatha Christie from the mid-20s, and actually was more than a secretary. She was originally employed, I think, to be a secretary / sort of governess to Rosalind.
Mm-hmm.
But she was with Agatha throughout the disappearance. After the disappearance, she was one of the 2 witnesses at Agatha and Max's wedding. The other witness being her sister, Mary. And then obviously they were friends for the rest of their lives.
Right. And just to be clear, the other witness being Carlo's sister, Mary,
yes.
Mary Fisher. Yeah. And actually, Carlo has the rare distinction of having 2 dedications, although both of them are shared. So in a way, it's just like she has 2 halves. One of them is with Peter, the dog, for the mystery of the Blue Train. And then the second is with her sister, with Mary, and then there were none. And I do just have to shout out the Order of the Faithful Dog, which is mentioned in that dedication for the mystery of the Blue Train. It was a shared joke between Carlo and Agatha that after everything that had happened to her, she could divide up her acquaintance between those who were friends and those who weren't. And the friends, the people who were loyal to her and stuck by her, were part of the Order of the Faithful Dog. And Carlo is stated to be within that order in the dedication, along with the literal dog, Peter. And this is clearly someone who was there in good times and bad times and just stuck by her and was always a friend. And even though, she sort of had a retirement period, it seems, where she stopped working for Christie. And then, she did have a life after that. But it seems that they remained very close. They always considered each other very good friends. I'm glad for Christie's sake that she had someone like that, especially to help bring her through that period of the disappearance and the aftermath of that, and then the divorce and the aftermath of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And actually, we've now got, I think we mentioned this on the fictional secretaries episode, that we had a couple of secretaries and their sisters. We have a real life one here as well.
This is true. Maybe that's the inspiration. I mean, I don't have any sense of what Mary Fisher was like. No. I honestly don't really have that much of a sense of what Carla was like either, because I think it's so filtered through Christie. But she seems to be a very lively sort of a person, and obviously very, very loyal. Someone who also Rosalind got to know very well. Yeah, we talked about the ways in which, secretaries they straddle the line between business and personal because it's a business relationship. They are an employee, but in that they're part of the family circle, they can really practically become one of the family. And I would say that Carlo is a secretary who became part of the family.
Absolutely.
And Christie, I think, would have put it the same way. There's no question. There's no contest that Carlo should be the top secretary here, both for the strength of their relationship, but also the fact that she is the one who was the main secretary to Christie. She had other typists and, people of that order who we've talked about lower down on this list, but this was the one who, more than any other, I think, supplied that kind of primary secretarial position. And also, it's not surprising, I think, the time in which she did was earlier in the 20th century, when these people would live with the family or nearby and like really be part of that family circle. And that was a model that was just, I think, more sustainable earlier in the 20th century than it became certainly in the 60s and 70s when people just weren't doing that as much. So we can sort of see the evolution, I think, of the ways in which Christie herself made use of the secretaries and secretarial work as her life went through the 20s. It's a similar evolution as to what she reflected in her work.
Yes, because I think Charlotte was living with Agatha and Archie, wasn't she? When
I believe she was, especially in Styles, when they were in Styles and the disappearance occurred. She was away that night. I remember that she was away that night, and that was one of the reasons that Christie was able to disappear in the way that she did, but that she was normally there. So yes. Very, very interesting. And she certainly never told any tales or succumbed to any of the pressure that I have to imagine she was under as to people asking her, well, what really happened? What was going on? Just not even a peep, unlike Elsa. Or Elsa's family. I don't want to malign poor Elsa Jolly. But yeah, and I think that's also part of why Christie so appreciated her friendship.
Definitely an OFD.
Well, those are the 10 real-life secretaries of Agatha Christie. I mean, because you're the one that made this list, Helen, not me, to be clear. Were there any other secretaries who you didn't include, or were you straining to get to the 10? Were you working toward 10?
I would love to say that there were some honourable mentions, but no, I think this was it. I don't think there was anybody that I cut from the list.
Well, good on you for getting to 10, because it's always I love a good top 10 list. And like I said, when we were covering the fictional secretaries, at first I was just going to cover these as a little addendum at the end of that episode, but it's such a good list. And I think it's so interesting to think about the secretaries, within Agatha Christie's own personal experience and how that reflects onto her fictional secretaries, that I think this was really deserving of its own episode. And I'm so glad that we were able to do it and that I've monopolized as much of your time as I have. I was joking to Helen off mic that I've really called her bluff here. I mean, she wrote in and said, oh, you should do the secretaries and look at this. And I was like, oh, well, guess what, Helen? You're doing it with me. Hours later, poor Helen, we've been recording 2 episodes here. This is a lot of work. And I just want you to know how much I appreciate it and how much I've enjoyed doing this with you.
Yeah, well, I have had an absolute blast. And I will recommend to anybody, if you have an idea, send it into Kemper. And if he offers to invite you on, then grab the opportunity with both hands.
You too can be put to work for the All About Agatha podcast. Well, thank you so much, Helen. And you know what? I hope to be able to have you on again at some point, because this was just a real delight.
Well, I hope to see you in Torquay.
At the festival. You will be at the festival. Wonderful. All right. Thank you. Thank you again to Helen Frank for being my intrepid co-host on not 1, but 2 episodes, 2 fantastic episodes. She just did an outstanding job. I'm so grateful for all her hard work and dedication and the time she gave me recording both those episodes. You are a truly A+ listener, Helen. Thank you, thank you, thank you. For my next episode, I am going to be interviewing the thriller author Riley Sager. This is a big one, folks. Riley Sager is a hugely best-selling writer. He has put out hit after hit for 9 years now, a book a year for 9 years. And his most recent work, which is titled With a Vengeance, is steeped in Agatha Christie. It directly references 2 Christie crown jewels, and it was just a great opportunity to have him on the podcast and to discuss all things mystery and Christie, so I'm really looking forward to that. If you would like some bonus content, head on over to the podcast's Patreon page. I've got a link in the show notes. For August, I will be discussing Travels with Agatha Christie and Sir David Suchet, a ridiculously charming BritBox documentary in which Sir David follows in Agatha Christie's footsteps on her around-the-world tour that she took over 100 years ago in 1922. Fascinating stuff. You can always email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. You can find the podcast on Instagram at allaboutagatha, and you can find me at my author website, kemperdonovan.com. Links to Instagram and my website in the show notes, along with links to my first 2 mysteries in the Ghostwriter Mysteries series. I recently sold a 4th book in that series, by the way. The 3rd one has not yet come out. That will be next year, but the 4th one will come out the year after that. So the Ghostwriter Mysteries live on. I'm very excited about that. And I'm also always very excited to get ratings and/or reviews for this podcast. So please keep those coming. And I'll see you next time. Bye.